Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. Language is often treated as a tool of communication, a practical instrument for transmitting information between individuals. Yet, this description, while not incorrect, is incomplete. Communication is not the primary function of language. It is a derivative consequence of deeper and more fundamental role. Language first operates within the individual mind as the medium through which perceptual experience becomes conceptual knowledge, and through which knowledge becomes purposive action. Only after this internal function is established does language extend outward to coordinate activity among persons, institutions, and cultures. Thus, language is not merely social. It is epistemological, psychological, and developmental. It is the principal mechanism through which consciousness organizes reality into intelligible structure. In Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Ayn Rand writes, quote, "In order to be used as a single unit, the enormous sum integrated by a concept has to be given the form of a single, specific, perceptual concrete, which will differentiate it from all other concretes and from all other concepts." This is the function performed by language. Language is a code of visual auditory symbols that serves the psychoepistemological function of converting concepts into mental equivalent of concretes. Language is the exclusive domain and tool of concepts. Every word we use, in parentheses with the exception of proper names, is a symbol that denotes a concept, i.e., that stands for an unlimited number of concretes of a certain kind. End of quote. Human experience begins in a field of perceptual flux. Sensory input arrives as a continuous stream of differentiated stimuli. Shapes, sounds, textures, intensities, movements. Without organization, these remain momentary impressions, unbound and unstable. Language introduces stability by enabling the formation of units. Through naming, similarities are identified, differences are preserved, and recurring patterns become conceptually graspable. The word does not merely label an object already fully known. It functions as an instrument of cognitive compression, enabling the mind to hold a multiplicity of instances within a single mental unit. The concept tree, for example, integrates innumerable perceptual encounters into a stable referential identity. Through this process, perception becomes knowledge. This first movement may be understood as inductive. Language gathers perceptual material and stabilizes it into conceptual form. Each word condenses experience. preserving identity across variation. Without such condensation, knowledge could not accumulate. Every encounter would remain isolated within the present moment. Language, therefore, extends the temporal reach of consciousness by enabling memory to operate not as a mere archive of images, but as an organized structure of meaning. The world becomes navigable because it becomes nameable. Once conceptual units are formed, language enables a second movement, integration. Concepts do not remain isolated. They enter relations with other concepts. Grammar expresses relations of agency, causality, condition, and sequence. Syntax establishes order. Logical structure ensures coherence. Narrative integrates temporal development into intelligible continuity. Through these mechanisms, language becomes the architecture of thought itself. Scientific explanation, philosophical reasoning, legal formulation, and ethical judgment all depend upon the capacity of language to bind units into systems of meaning that preserve consistency across contexts. Integration expands the scope of cognition. A single concept provides recognition. A structured system provides understanding. Through linguistic integration, the mind constructs models of reality that extend beyond immediate perception. Causes may be inferred, possibilities projected, probabilities evaluated. The future becomes conceivable because relations discovered in the past can be articulated and extended forward through linguistic formulation. Language, therefore, transforms experience into orientation. It renders existence intelligible as a field of structured potential. The third movement of language connects knowledge to action. Once relations are understood, sequence of operation may be articulated. Instructions, plans, procedures, and strategies are all linguistic formulations that guide the execution of behavior. Inner speech functions as the interface between cognition and motor activity. One silently formulates steps, anticipates obstacles, evaluates outcomes, and corrects errors. Language becomes the regulatory structure of purposive action. It enables the individual not merely to react, but to direct activity toward chosen ends. Through linguistic formulation, intention becomes operational. These three movements, induction, integration, and reduction, describe the recursive cycle through which consciousness develops competence and extends its reach. Language stabilizes perception into conceptual units, organizes those units into coherent systems, and translates those systems into executable patterns of action. The cycle repeats continuously, generating increasingly complex structures of knowledge and increasingly refined forms of agency. Human development may therefore be understood as progressive refinement of linguistic integration. The social dimension of language emerges as an expansion of this prior cognitive function. Once knowledge can be articulated symbolically, it becomes transferable across individuals. Cooperation becomes possible beyond immediate imitation because shared conceptual frameworks allow coordination of effort. Division of labor, legal systems, scientific institutions, and cultural traditions all depend upon linguistic stability. Through language, knowledge accumulates across generations. Experience is no longer confined to the lifespan of the individual, but becomes part of cumulative historical process. Civilization itself may be understood as the long-term stabilization of linguistic integration. Yet the social function of language presupposes its intrapersonal role. Each participant in a shared linguistic system must first possess the capacity to integrate perception conceptually. The collective field of meaning is constructed from individual acts of understanding. Social reality, therefore, does not generate language. Rather, language generates the possibility of complex social reality. Institutions are stabilized patterns of linguistic coordination, structured around shared abstractions such as law, value, responsibility, and obligation. Language also structures the continuity of the self. Through linguistic narration, memory becomes temporally organized into identity. One understands oneself not merely as a succession of experiences, but as persistent unity extended through time. The capacity to formulate intentions linguistically enables projection into the future and evaluation of possible courses of action. Language thereby contributes to the coherence of personal agency. The self becomes intelligible to itself through linguistic integration. From this perspective, language may be understood as the primary symbolic medium of integration in human existence. It binds perception to concept, concept to system, system to action, and individual understanding to knowledge. It functions as a compression mechanism, reducing the complexity of experience into manageable units while preserving essential structure. It functions as a binding mechanism, maintaining coherence across levels of abstraction. It functions as a control mechanism, enabling purposive transformation of the environment. The universality of language does not consist in uniform vocabulary or grammar, but in the structural role language plays within cognition. Every human language, despite surface differences, performs the same fundamental operations: differentiation of identity, preservation of similarity, articulation of relation, and coordination of action. The diversity of languages reflects variation in historical development. The common function reflects the invariant requirements of human consciousness. Language is therefore neither merely expressive nor merely communicative. It is constitutive of rational agency. Through language, the mind becomes capable of organizing experience into knowledge and directing knowledge toward chosen ends. It is the medium through which the many are grasped as one, and through which the one unfolds into the many. Language does not arise in abstraction from life. It is formed within the conditions that life imposes. Human beings do not speak merely to exchange sounds or symbols, but to orient themselves within a reality structured by needs, limits, risks, and possibilities. If language is the symbolic medium through which consciousness integrates experience into knowledge and directs action toward chosen ends, then the structure of language must reflect the structure of the conditions under which human beings exist. Among the most persistent of these conditions are appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty. These four lessons of life do not merely influence the content of language, they shape its very architecture. They determine what must be differentiated, what must be preserved, what must be communicated, and what must be understood. Appetite represents the organism's orientation toward acquisition and enhancement. Life requires energy, material resources, and conditions that sustain and improve functioning. As a result, language develops extensive vocabularies of valuation. Words emerge to distinguish what is beneficial from what is harmful, what is desirable from what is undesirable, what is useful from what is wasteful. Comparative structures such as better, worse, more, less, optimal, and efficient express gradations of value in relation to the fulfillment of needs. Even abstract domains such as knowledge and beauty are linguistically structured through evaluative distinctions that originate in the necessity of choosing among alternatives. Appetite gives language direction. Without the pressure to pursue what sustains and enhances life, language would remain descriptive but would lack prioritization. The linguistic articulation of value transforms impulse into intention, enabling the individual to identify, compare, and select among possible courses of action. Through language, appetite becomes purpose. Vulnerability introduces a second dimension of linguistic structure, the need for coordination and protection. Human beings are not self-sufficient organisms isolated from one another. They exist within networks of dependence and interaction. Exposure to harm and the need for cooperation generate linguistic forms that regulate relationships. Words such as trust, promise, agreement, obligation, responsibility, and justice arise from the necessity of stabilizing expectations among individuals whose actions affect one another. Pronouns differentiate self from other. Social grammar marks degrees of distance or familiarity. Moral language articulates standards of conduct that reduce the unpredictability of interpersonal behavior. Institutions themselves are stabilized linguistic constructs, sustained through shared definitions of rights, duties, and commitments. Vulnerability, therefore, gives rise to the ethical dimension of language. It makes possible the articulation of norms that protect individuals from arbitrary harm while enabling productive coordination. Fragility adds a temporal dimension to linguistic organization. Valuable states do not persist automatically. They require maintenance and care. Health can deteriorate, relationships can weaken, institutions can collapse, knowledge can be forgotten. Language develops modalities of preservation in response to this recognition. Terms such as maintain, sustain, repair, restore, prevent, and conserve express awareness that value must be protected against degradation. Technical vocabularies in medicine, engineering, ecology, and law reflect refined linguistic responses to fragility. Grammar itself incorporates structures that encode obligation and precaution, such as should and must, expressing the necessity of action directed toward preservation. Narrative forms frequently revolve around the protection or recovery of something at risk, reflecting the persistent presence of fragility within human experience. Through language, fragility becomes intelligible as a condition requiring foresight and care. What is valued must be sustained through continuous adjustment of action across time. Uncertainty introduces the epistemic dimension of language. Human beings act without complete knowledge of future conditions. Outcomes are probabilistic. Causes are not always immediately visible. And the consequences of action must often be inferred rather than directly observed. Language adapts to uncertainty by developing structures that express possibility, probability, hypothesis, and explanation. Words such as if, possible, likely, because, therefore, and estimate allow the mind to construct models of causal relation and to anticipate alternative outcomes. Scientific reasoning refines these linguistic tools into explicit methodologies for managing uncertainty through systematic observation and inference. Grammar incorporates conditional and future forms that enable projection beyond present perception. Without uncertainty, explanation would not be required, and learning would lose its orientation. Language, therefore, becomes the medium through which incomplete knowledge is progressively transformed into more reliable understanding. These four conditions do not operate independently. They form an integrated structure of pressures that shape linguistic evolution. Appetite directs attention toward acquisition of value. Vulnerability necessitates coordination with others. Fragility requires preservation across time. Uncertainty demands continual revision of knowledge. Language develops semantic fields, grammatical distinctions, and narrative forms that enable human beings to navigate these conditions with increasing precision. Words do not merely describe the world, they organize orientation toward the world in relation to what must be gained, protected, preserved, and understood. The universality of certain linguistic distinctions across cultures reflects the recurrence of these existential conditions. Languages everywhere differentiate between good and bad, past and future, cause and effect, self and other. These distinctions are not arbitrary conventions, but responses to the structural requirements of living systems operating within dynamic environments. An individual must identify sources of nourishment, detect threats, maintain stability, and anticipate change. Language becomes the symbolic extension of these adaptive processes, enabling them to operate at increasingly abstract levels. Through linguistic integration, human beings transform immediate pressures into conceptual structures that can be examined, communicated, and improved. Appetite becomes articulated value. Vulnerability becomes ethical relation. Fragility becomes responsibility for preservation. Uncertainty becomes inquiry. Each condition generates a field of meaning within which experience can be interpreted and action can be directed. Language allows these fields to interconnect, forming coherent frameworks that guide development across individual and life. Thus, language is shaped not only by cognitive capacity, but by the structure of existence itself. The necessity to obtain energy, avoid harm, maintain integrity, and anticipate change produces recurring patterns of attention and differentiation that language stabilizes symbolically. Through language, these conditions become intelligible and therefore manageable. Human beings do not merely undergo appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty, they conceptualize them, evaluate them, and respond to them through purposive integration. Language, therefore, reflects the adaptive intelligence of life-seeking continuity under constraint. It transforms the pressures of existence into structured understanding and coordinated action. In doing so, It enables the individual not only to survive, but to progressively refine the conditions of existence themselves. Through language, the lessons of life become sources of knowledge, and knowledge becomes the means through which life expands its own possibilities. Language is not merely a vehicle for expressing thought. It is itself an expression of the structure of thought. Because human cognition operates through symbolic integration, the linguistic forms individuals produce inevitably reflect the organization of their psychological processes. The words one selects, the structure of sentences one forms, the intensity one conveys, and the degree of precision or ambiguity one tolerates are not arbitrary stylistic variations. They are manifestations of how perception, value, emotion, and volition are organized within the individual. Language, therefore, serves not only as a medium of communication, but also as a diagnostic instrument through which the underlying structure of the mind becomes observable. Every act of linguistic expression involves the selection and arrangement of conceptual units. These units do not arise spontaneously in isolation. They are the product of prior processes of differentiation and integration. A person who has formed stable conceptual distinctions is able to communicate with clarity, maintaining consistency of reference across context. Terms retain their meaning, relations remain coherent, and conclusions follow from identifiable premises. In such expression, the structure of language mirrors the structure of cognition, hierarchical, organized, and internally consistent. Conversely, when conceptual boundaries are unstable, linguistic expression often reveals fragmentation. Words may shift meaning within the same discourse. Assertions may contradict one another. The causal connections may be implied rather than articulated. The linguistic surface reflects the difficulty of maintaining integration across levels of abstraction. The presence or absence of causal articulation is particularly revealing. Language that explicitly identifies relations of cause and effect demonstrates the capacity to connect events within an intelligible framework. The use of terms such as because, therefore, if, and thus signals that experience is being organized into a structured model of reality. Such language indicates an orientation toward explanation rather than mere association. Where causal articulation is weak or absent, discourse may become episodic, driven more by immediate impressions than by integrated understanding. The individual may describe events but may not fully connect them into a coherent explanatory system. The degree to which causal language appears therefore reflects the degree to which experience has been conceptually integrated. Expression also reveals the organization of emotional valuation. Language conveys not only what is perceived, but what is considered significant. Emotional intensity, expressed through linguistic amplification, often reflects perceived stakes. Terms such as always, never, completely, or absolutely signal attempts to stabilize evaluation by removing ambiguity. When such intensity is proportionate to context, it reflects strong but calibrated value commitment. When intensity becomes generalized across context, it may indicate difficulty differentiating degrees of importance. Emotional differentiation becomes visible in linguistic nuance. The ability to distinguish disappointment from frustration, concern from fear, curiosity from anxiety. The refinement of emotional vocabulary often parallels the refinement of value structure. Where linguistic expression collapses distinctions into broad categories of approval or disapproval, the underlying evaluative system may lack sufficient differentiation to guide proportionate response. Temporal structure within language likewise reveals the continuity of the self. Individuals who integrate past experience with present orientation and future intention typically employ balanced temporal framing. They relate prior events to present understanding and project possible outcomes into the future. Language becomes the medium through which identity maintains continuity across time. When discourse becomes restricted to a single temporal dimension, whether fixation on past grievance, absorption in immediate sensation, or abstract speculation disconnected from present conditions, the linguistic pattern may indicate a constriction in the integration of experience. Temporal language reveals the extent to which the individual perceives life as a continuous developmental process rather than as disconnected moments. Intensity of expression further reflects perceived urgency of integration demands. Language characterized by persistent absolutism may indicate a perceived need to eliminate ambiguity in order to maintain stability of meaning. Repetition, amplification, or categorical formulation can serve as attempts to reinforce conceptual certainty when underlying integration feels threatened. Conversely, excessive hedging may signal difficulty committing to stable evaluation in the presence of uncertainty. Neither intensity nor restraint is inherently problematic. Both must be interpreted relative to context. What becomes psychologically informative is the proportionality between linguistic emphasis and situational demands. Language calibrated to context suggests flexible integration, while rigid patterns of amplification or minimization suggest constraints in the modulation of evaluation. Much of what language reveals about psychological organization is conveyed implicitly rather than explicitly. Individuals may explicitly assert calmness, confidence, or clarity, while implicitly revealing tension, uncertainty, or ambiguity through syntactic fragmentation, shifting reference points, or excessive qualification. Metaphors, narrative structure, and patterns of emphasis often reveal underlying cognitive orientation more reliably than explicit declarations. The implicit dimension of language, therefore, provides insight into the degree of alignment between stated belief and operative integration. Consistency between explicit assertion and an implicit structure tends to indicate coherence of cognitive organization, while divergence may signal unresolved tension within the system of evaluation. The four fundamental conditions of life, appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty, are also reflected in linguistic patterns. Language-rich and evaluative distinctions often indicate active orientation toward acquisition and improvement. Relational sensitivity appears in careful calibration of pronouns, commitments, and expressions of trust or caution. Attention to fragility appears in linguistic emphasis on preservation, maintenance, and risk mitigation. Sensitivity to uncertainty appears in probabilistic language, conditional constructions, and openness to revision. Each linguistic pattern reveals how the individual organizes attention in response to the persistent conditions of existence. The balance among these patterns provides insight into dominant motivational orientation and adaptive strategy. Language, therefore, performs a dual function. It integrates experience into communicable form, and it reveals the structure of the integration achieved. Through linguistic observation, one may infer the availability of conceptual distinctions, the stability of value hierarchies, the calibration of emotional response, and the flexibility of cognitive adaptation. Speech and writing become external traces of internal organization. The mind becomes partially visible in the structure of the symbols it produces. This does not imply that language provides a complete or infallible representation of psychological reality. Individuals may intentionally modify expression, adopt rhetorical strategies, or adopt linguistic style or to social context. Nevertheless, patterns tend to persist across time, and recurrent linguistic tendency often reflects stable features of cognitive organization. Careful attention to linguistic structure, therefore, provides a valuable source of insight into how individuals construct meaning, regulate emotion, and orient action within the conditions of life. Language reveals what distinctions the mind can make, what relations it is able to perceive, what priorities it is prepared to pursue, and what uncertainties it is willing to tolerate. Because language functions as the operational medium of integration, the quality of linguistic organization frequently parallels the quality of psychological organization. The form of expression becomes an indirect but meaningful indicator of the structure of consciousness engaged in the task of understanding reality and directing life within it. Across the preceding analysis, language emerges not merely as a tool of communication, but as the central medium through which human existence becomes intelligible, structured, and directed. Language is the symbolic form of integration, the process by which the flux of perception is transformed into conceptual stability, by which conceptual stability becomes organized knowledge, and by which knowledge becomes purposive action within the conditions of life. It is both the instrument of cognition and the expression of cognition, both the means of coordinating with reality and the means of coordinating with one another. Through language, the individual mind becomes capable of binding the many into the one and unfolding the one into the many. First, we established language as the primary integrative medium of consciousness. Human beings do not merely experience reality, they organize it. Perception alone provides immediacy but not continuity, differentiation but not hierarchy, sensation but not system. Language enables the formation of conceptual units that preserve identity across variation. Words stabilize experience, allowing memory to operate not as a collection of impressions, but as a structured network of meaning. Through grammar and logic, these conceptual units are integrated into coherent frameworks that extend understanding beyond the present moment. Through inner speech, these frameworks guide action. Language, therefore, forms the recursive structure linking perception, knowledge, and behavior. It is the operating medium of rational agency. Second, we demonstrated that language is shaped by the fundamental conditions of life: appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty. These conditions define the adaptive pressures under which symbolic systems evolve. Appetite directs attention toward acquisition and improvement, generating linguistic distinctions of value and preference. Vulnerability necessitates coordination with others, producing vocabularies of trust, obligation, and responsibility. Fragility produces temporal awareness requiring linguistic structures that express preservation, maintenance, and care. Uncertainty stimulates inquiry, giving rise to linguistic forms capable of expressing possibility, probability, and explanation. Language reflects these recurring conditions because human beings must continuously orient themselves toward what must be gained, protected, preserved, and understood. The semantic architecture of language, therefore, mirrors the existential architecture of life. Third, we show that language not only integrates experience, but reveals the degree of integration achieved within the individual. Because linguistic expression is structured by conceptual organization, it provides observable indicators of psychological state. The coherence of discourse reflects the coherence of understanding conceptual hierarchy. The differentiation of emotional vocabulary reflects the refinement of value structure. The proportionality of expression reflects the calibration of evaluative judgment. Patterns of causality, temporality, and reference reveal how experience is organized across context and across time. Language thus functions diagnostically as well as communicatively. The structure of expression reveals how the individual integrates perception, valuation, and intention within the conditions imposed by existence. Taken together, these three perspectives converge in a single principle. Language is the medium through which human beings integrate reality and reveal the quality of that integration. It is shaped by necessities of life, structured by processes of cognition, and expressive of the organization of the self. Language enables continuity of knowledge across generations, coordination of action within societies, and coherence of identity within the individual. Through language, experience becomes communicable, knowledge becomes cumulative, and action becomes purposive. The universality of language does not lie in uniform vocabulary, but in the invariant functions it performs. Every language, regardless of its historical development, must enable the differentiation of identity, the articulation of relation, the expression of value, and the projection of possibility. These functions arise from the requirement of life itself. The diversity of linguistic forms reflect variation in cultural history. The common structure reflects the shared conditions under which human consciousness operates. Language, therefore, occupies a central position in the architecture of human development. It binds perception to abstraction, abstraction to understanding, understanding to action, and individual action to civilization. It mediates between the immediacy of experience and the continuity of knowledge. It allows human beings not only to respond to reality, but to progressively refine their understanding of reality and their manner of living within it. Through language, the individual becomes capable of self-direction, cooperation, preservation of value, and expansion of knowledge beyond immediate circumstance. In this sense, language may be understood as the primary symbolic expression of integration in human life. It reflects the necessity to orient toward value, to coordinate with others, to preserve what is fragile, and to learn under conditions of uncertainty. It reveals the structure of thought while simultaneously enabling thought to achieve greater clarity. It is both the instrument through which the human mind organizes reality and the medium through which that organization becomes visible. Language is therefore not only a means of expression but a condition of development. Through its integrative function, human beings transform the pressures of existence into structures of understanding, and structures of understanding into patterns of purposeful action. The growth of language parallels the growth of the self, and the refinement of language parallels the refinement of integration itself. Through language, human existence becomes progressively intelligible to itself, and therefore progressively capable of deliberate improvement. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.